My name is Elika, and I am inspired by, and have for a long time been inspired by, a rather famous woman called Simone de Beauvoir. And I'm just going to talk about her a little bit. You might find on your tables you've got some of these, which are two things. They're pictures of her. She was rather extraordinary looking, very beautiful, very strong. And she really loved having her picture taken, which is not always true of philosophers. And actually her image, I think, is quite well known and reminds us of an amazing time in Paris, kind of golden time of thinking and of change. But I'm not sure that what she actually wrote or thought or said is as well known. She gets a bit hidden. She sometimes gets a bit hidden behind somebody, who I mostly am not going to talk about. And on the back are some of the things that she wrote, and I deliberately chose to either put them in French or English. So I appreciate, for some of you, you might not read French. They might be nice things to have on, because that was the language in which she wrote. But you might want to swap with someone. So Simone de Beauvoir matters a lot to me because these days I'm a theatre director and have been for quite a long time, but secretly I'm a philosopher. And I think they are sometimes almost the same thing. But I didn't know that when I was 17. And like more people than care to admit it, I wanted to be French. I thought that being French was just much more elegant and intriguing and chic and beautiful than being English. And there's a moment in one of Simone's novels, actually, where she's one of the characters. She writes always about herself. The character that is most like her in that book, Françoise, she's described by another character as always looking a little bit undone, a little bit unfinished, which is a very French criticism. And I identify with that because I am in fact English and always a little bit undone, not quite finished. In one of these pictures, this one, she's got a marvellous lock of hair just doing whatever it wants to do, which is a very un-French thing, and my hair does that too. And I then got very interested in philosophy because I didn't know what it was, and a teacher suggested I might like it. And there was a kind of innocence about my meeting with it, which I'm really grateful for, because most people meet it as this terrible idea. Why would you want to do that? And I met it, and I fell in love really with the idea of asking questions, which she does very well, and great philosophers do very well. She didn't describe herself as a philosopher, she talked of herself as a writer. Writing was what mattered to her. But for me, she was part of a whole movement of philosophy that asked questions that were really quite difficult questions, particularly then. Simone was born in 1908, and when she was 42, in 1949, she wrote The Second Sex. I don't think it's a coincidence that I am 42 this year. So The Second Sex, which is her most famous book, is a really peculiar book. It's a giant tome. Here it is. Here's one version of it. Encyclopedia, tiny, tiny, tiny writing. Here. Mostly published in 2 volumes. And it's a book about being a woman. It's a book about all women. It's outrageous. It's wrong a lot of the time about most things. It's emotionally incredibly courageous. It talks about how she sees womanhood from where she's standing. It talks about how she sees her own womanhood, but then she, rather grandly and brilliantly, talks about all women. And so, as a result, she isn't always very well liked by the feminist community, because she didn't make things very easy. She said some very provocative things, and she said some things which I think might be wrong. But what she did was say them. and for that I'm very grateful. I'm going to read a little bit to you in French because I'd prefer to be French. So in the introduction to Le Deuxième Sexe, she says, j'ai longtemps hésité à écrire un livre sur la femme. Le sujet est irritant, surtout pour les femmes, et il n'est pas neuf. La querelle du féminisme a fait couler assez d'encre. À présent, elle est peu après close. N'en parlons plus. Which, in English, is for a long time I have hesitated to write a book about women. The subject is irritating, especially to women. And it is not new. This is 1949. Enough ink has been spilled in quarrelling over feminism, and perhaps we should say no more about it. What I love about that quote, it's provocative, it's naughty, it's obviously wrong. But it's at the beginning of the biggest book about women anyone has ever written. So she's also not telling the truth. The famous quote, which is on the same card if you've got it, is about not being born a woman. She says one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman. And which is much quoted. And I do think that something in that philosophy has always meant quite a lot to me. She suggests something very bold and not based at all in science. But she suggests that we choose how much of a woman we want to be. And of course science has explored all sorts of other ways of thinking about gender and about identity. But there's something in that that I found liberating, to say, actually you can choose how much of a man you want to be. You can choose how much of a woman, and therefore you can choose what kind of human being you want to be. She talks a lot about human beings. She finds the idea of men and women a bit irritating. If we could all just be human beings, wouldn't it be a wonderful place? There's something in that for me. She talks about love, kind of buried in the back of The Second Sex, and it's much less often quoted. I think partly because it's this crazy stream of consciousness about how she sees love and how she feels about love. And someone was reminding me, there was an article last weekend talking about one of her lesser-known love affairs. She had a great many love affairs, not just with that little fella. And in 1949, she had fallen completely head over heels in love with an American man, and yet she tries to write through this passion that is also on the other side of the world, so particularly compelling and plausible. She tries to write coolly and objectively about love. She gives herself away at every turn, I think. But in doing so, there are some things that I think we women, I'm going to sound a bit like someone now, we women don't talk about enough. Just that in between making extraordinary things happen in the world, we scurry away in corners and talk about our love lives as though nothing has changed in 60 years, or 400, 3,000. And that intrigues me, that relationship between the two. So forgive me a little more French, just to humour my fantasy. Le mot amour n'a pas du tout le même sens pour l'un et l'autre sexe. Et c'est là une source des graves malentendus qui les séparent. Des hommes ont pu être à un certain moment de leur existence des amants passionnés, mais il n'en est pas un qu'on puisse définir comme un grand amoureux. Forgive me, every man here or elsewhere who disagrees. What that means, let me find it for you. Yeah. She says the word love has by no means the same sense for both sexes, and this is one of the causes of the most serious misunderstandings that divide them. Men have found it possible to be passionate lovers at certain times in their lives, but there is not one of them who would want to be called a great lover. outrageous. It's wrong, it's provocative, and there's something in it. She goes on, I'll tell you in English. In their most violent transport, she's talking about men, they never abdicate completely. Even on their knees before a mistress, what they still want is to take possession of her. At the very heart of their lives, they remain sovereign subjects. The beloved woman is only one value among others. They want to integrate her into their existence, rather than squandering their entire existence on her. So there's something that she is scratching away at, about being brought up to think that you are not a sovereign subject, that you can't choose your life, that you can't decide who you want to be and how much or little influence you have on the world. And so she tries to explain her grand love for all sorts of people in her life. And as I say, I think there's something in it. There's something that I know I battle with, about how much I believe I can choose, and how much I believe that there's just me making those decisions, and no one else. It sounds a bit lonely, that's the trouble with it. Maybe it is. A little story about Simone. So she wrote my favourite of her novels called The Blood of Others, which she wrote right at the end of the Second World War in 1945. She'd lived through extraordinary times in Paris. It's very turbulent times, you can imagine, through the occupation. And she wrote about the resistance. She wrote about a love affair in the centre of the resistance, a young woman who found herself by accident in the movement, and a young man who tried not to fall in love because he was busy fighting the Nazis. But he did, in fact, fall in love. She contradicts her later work. He talks about, to understand this, I might just say, he talks, the character, about how this young woman, he's involved in some terrible crimes, some terrible events, seems to him as innocent as a stone, and how he sees himself as a kind of rock, he's been throwing himself at things and causing terrible destruction, which is a metaphor about stones and rocks coming up. Mais que seulement je m'emploie à défendre ce bien suprême qui rend innocent et vain toutes les pierres et tous les rocs, ce bien qui sauve chaque homme de tous les autres et de moi-même, la liberté. Alors ma passion n'aura pas été inutile. So he's looking at his lover and he's saying, if only I could continue to fight for freedom, then perhaps it might be that my passion was not in vain, was not useless. Something in what's happened with you makes me think that perhaps it's not in vain, even though you've died. Now, at the end of a very long and complex and very brilliant book called Being Nothingness, by that little bit, funny eyes, he says, l'homme est une passion inutile. Man is a useless passion. And this is at the heart of a kind of strand of existential thinking, that we must remember that we are limited in the effect we can have. It is grand of us, it is imaginary of us to think that we are God, we are only human. And we try, and sometimes something happens because we try, and sometimes we don't try and something happens anyway. It's a pretty miserable way to look at the world, but there's some truth in that too. So in this book, which is why I read it to you in French, in Simone's novel, at the end she says, alors ma passion n'aura pas été inutile. And the critics almost universally said, she's misunderstood what he meant. She said the opposite. She hasn't understood that what he meant is that man is a useless passion. But what she did was publicly and boldly and obviously contradict him. And she loved him very much. But that inspires me that she could do that. She says just really near the end of the second sex that we're going to have to change a lot of things if we're going to truly have equality between men and women, most especially economics. I think there's lots of things she'd like about 2012, but I think she'd be horrified at how little has changed. And at the end of the same paragraph, she says women are going to have to cut their own clothes. And I'm intrigued by her image, as you can tell, and I'm intrigued by what she means by that, about we need to choose what we wear and who we are, not just necessarily pretend to be a man. And I mostly wear men's trousers and very neutral, almost masculine outfits. But I secretly want to wear red shoes. So for Simone, I'm wearing my red shoes today. Thank you very much.